Good day, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for this episode of ISSA Canada's Power Hour. I I don't know if most of you attended last session, but Brad was focusing on recruiting, and this time we're going to focus on onboarding. So we all know that labor is a definite pain point in our industry. And, who would have thought that in addition to trying to find labor, trying to keep them is probably a bigger part of the entire picture. So we've got Brad Ratz here, and he is the Director of Growth Strategy and Customer Experience at H2R Business Solutions. And he's going to walk us through his presentation to hopefully provide us with some strategies today to help you in your onboarding and recruitment and retention, rather, strategies. Take it away, Brad.
All right. Thanks for the great handoff and intro. And I'm excited today to talk about onboarding strategies for organizations and more importantly, effective strategies that will, show a clear ROI. Um, a little bit about myself. So I am the Director of Growth Strategy and Client Experience at H2R. I've held head of HR roles most recently for a property development firm. I'm a certified coach and a trained facilitator, and I do sit on several boards, advisory boards for organizations. So I'm from H2R. We are a HR consulting firm. So we provide fractional HR services. So for organizations that, may not be large enough to have a full-time HR team, but would still like the expertise and guidance of an HR um, uh, person on their team from a fractional HR. We also have a training and development division and offer customized workshops and pre-built workshops. And then we have a full recruitment division as well. One of the biggest things that I appreciate about H2R when I joined is if you do use our fractional HR services, you do get a dedicated consultant, whether or not you want to use us just for 1 hour or have us engaged monthly. You'll always get a consultant that learns your business and can help advise you specifically for your organization and how to support you. And so for today, we're going to talk about onboarding and specifically the mechanics of onboarding, what best practices we've seen. I've got a few templates that we've seen a lot of success with to share in the presentation as well, and hopefully give you some thoughts and some action items around how you can improve your onboarding and ultimately give a great experience for new candidates. And I don't have to share with onboarding and successfully retaining staff. There's a substantial cost benefit to the organization versus, accepting higher turnover and the cost with recruitment and retraining and the other ones, other elements that go along with that. And we're going to focus not just on the first day, but we're going to touch on mostly the first 0 to 30 days, but also look at that 60 to 90 day timeline. And so I'm going to spend a bit of time on this slide, but these are really some of the core components. And when we're helping clients, the first one we always start with is the pre-onboarding preparation. And so this is critical in terms of determining what that experience is going to look like and who owns delivering that experience for the new employee. And so in smaller organizations, this could be the owner, it could be a peer buddy or an employee. For larger organizations, it could be, a manager or a supervisor. But who really owns that, and are they prepared for that employee to come on the first day? An example that we see that can leave a bad taste or get things off to a bad start is something as simple as if it's a uniform-based operation, not having their uniform available for them on their first day or pre-start for their shift. So just being aware of it and building a process around it can automatically give you a head start versus others. Then you want to do a warm welcome and a company intro. And again, being purposeful with how you're delivering the company intro and the welcome to the employee. And some thoughts you can have with this would be around, so if you're a remote employee or out of office, how do you connect with them and what does that look like? If you're an off-site employee, so they're not working out of an office, but they are on site somewhere. Again, that can be very different in terms of what that welcome looks like. And typically, you want to look at this as more than just an email. Um, in terms of welcoming. I know emails are an easy communication avenue, but even if you can't connect with them in person, a phone call goes an incredibly long way, and a 5-minute phone call can give you a bigger return than a lot of other actions you can do, as a leader in an organization or as a business owner. And if you don't have a formal mission and vision and values as an organization, this can just be, how did you want them to feel on their first day? That's a very powerful question to ask. And if you can answer that, uh, it can really help elevate your onboarding experience. Do you want them to feel really like it's a very structured approach? Did you want them to feel really welcome? Did you want them to feel like it's a family environment? And when you start answering those, the process for the warm welcome and the company intro can kind of come to light if you don't have a formal mission, vision, and values. I'm going to talk a little bit later about clear role definition and a 30, 60, 90-day plan. It doesn't have to be robust. It doesn't have to be revolutionary. But just having something formally in place can really bring some structure and value to an onboarding. And people joining an organization are going to have a bit of anxiety. They're joining someplace that they're going to be spending a lot of time with, that they've committed to. And this shows that you're committed to them and that there is a plan in place. Other ones to think about for onboarding, of course, are the training and resources. And this is two avenues. The first one being training that's required. So most organizations would have some form of compliance training, whether that be, WMIS, if you're in Ontario, AODA, but some form of training. So you've got those. And then what does the role specific training look like? And how does that look like for an onboarding employee? And this is going to give you two benefits. One, a great onboarding experience, but two, it should give you consistency in the roles, especially as attrition occurs. So as you get turnover and you start really having an effective onboarding, you're going to see an elevation in new employees coming on board and the standards that you're setting. Buddy programs, which is being upfront with someone that they can contact that's either an expert in their role and has the knowledge or an expert in the organization, is statistically a very strong program that gives an incredibly high ROI. And it's not a lot of work to implement. It doesn't really cost anything. It's just making the introduction and making sure that it's very clear who they can reach out to should they have any questions and that they've got a buddy or a mentor there to help them through their onboarding journey and through the employment life cycle, to be honest. And then culture integration and regular check-ins and feedback. So typically we look at having a feedback loop built in with onboarding. And again, this can be a phone call. It can be a more formal process. It's as much or as little as you want it to be, but setting up some form of a feedback loop is critical. If the employee is uncertain about certain areas, or maybe training wasn't provided in a certain area, or they have more questions, they may not always be comfortable bringing them up. So creating a space where they can ask is critical. And again, it can be as big or as little of a program as you want it to be. So creating a positive day one experience. So this is something that is critical because they're going to be forming their opinion of the organization uh, on day one. This is their experience that they're going to be having, and more importantly, it's going to share and build how they feel about your organization. So some things to do and make sure are already in place before they walk in is sending new hire paperwork ahead of time, making sure that that's all filled out, making sure their workspace, tools, equipment, if they get a company vehicle, those elements are all in place, that all of their access is set up. And I'm going to show you a template on the next slide, but what to expect on the first day. And typically we look at the first week, creating clear expectations around what their first week is going to look like. Um, and the one thing I'll add too is if they don't have their new hire paperwork filled out, the one thing that I would add is if they start working without their new hire paperwork, there is a risk that their employment agreement would not be accepted, and then you would be bound by common law in your province and may not be bound by, in Ontario, as an example, the Employment Standards Act, which is typically what you would want to govern your employee-employer relationship. So I just wanted to flag that the new hire paperwork, having it completed in its entirety, including a signed employment agreement, is and can be very critical to organizations if the employee relationship were to shift, either by the employee or the employer. So on day one, providing simple day one, like providing scheduling, providing onboarding. Some best practices that we've seen are providing a lunch with their peer group, or with leadership, or again, just being intentional with that, and having them, what I say, break bread with their peers and creating that camaraderie amongst their peer group. That can set a lot of nerves at ease and start building those relationships and getting them introduced to the team. Being short or scheduling meet and greets one-on-one can also help them not only ask questions, but get to know who does what and where to go should they have any questions or need any support. Um, I know not every organization can have everyone meet with everyone. It's just not viable, but who should they meet with? If you can answer that question, you're generally going to start getting some answers and be able to build out a really good onboarding experience. And it could just be maybe they meet with just the owner or they meet with their direct supervisor on their first day. What does that look like? But again, being very purposeful with who they're going to meet with and what's capable within your organization. And the other critical one that we see from a return in terms of retention is typically the best onboarding programs start with culture. And you're going to start sharing around the environment they're going to work in, what makes you different than your competitors, what's the values of the organization, what makes you stand out. Starting with those elements leads to a stronger connection. And once they have a connection with your organization, they have a higher level of commitment. And of course, turnover or attrition goes down as an organization. And typically, especially on the first day, you do want to keep things, somewhat social and keep things positive because there is going to be that nervousness that you have to overcome on the first day. In terms of what that can look like, so this is one of my favorite templates. It's very, very simple. And so it is just your first week at a glance. Here's what Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday looks like, and what you're going to be doing on each day. I didn't put the names in here, but typically you would include the names of who they're going to meet. If there's a specific location they need to be at, you would include the location. And this would go out a day or two before their first day. And this is not something that costs anything. There's no software costs. It is just an email. But this one simple action can make all the difference in terms of onboarding. It shows in the eyes of the employee that you're organized, that you have a plan, that you have a process, and that they can feel safe and comfortable in your organization as they get into the role and learn the role. And it doesn't matter the level, this template seems to work. So whether or not they're very task-based, maybe not as many points on this, but it would show what they're going to learn from what task each day, when the follow-up may be, when they're going to be doing training, those different elements. So a very simplistic approach, but a high return on investment. in terms of onboarding and employee engagement. And then we've got around maintaining engagement in the first 90 days. So, an interesting stat is most employees decide if they're going to stick with an employer in the first 7 days. And what the data suggests is that over the first 5 days, they're going to connect with the organization and they're going to do what's almost like a gut check. And where the commitment lies is it's not the first 5 days that they're working, but it's typically the weekend, where they're going to reflect on how they're feeling about the role itself. If you go back to the hiring training that we did, was the role that was presented to them for the hiring, the role that they're doing, is their alignment there, and do they remain excited about the role? And so it's very critical for the first 7 days, but also most organizations over the first 90 days, that's really where they're going to buy in and fit within the organization. And so what we see as a best practice is developing 30, 60, and 90-day goals and tying those goals to measurable items. And this is something that you would want with either the leader and the employee or the owner and the employee or whoever their report would be to delve into. And my suggestion always is to have the employee guide this discussion in terms of what their goals are. And then the leader is really there to help just make sure that they are smart goals, that they're attainable, and that they're realistic, and that they relate to the job. Um, and so that's really the role of the leader in this case. Why that works out so well is because it creates commitment, an internal commitment for the employee, and typically, you're going to see a higher level of execution and a higher level of self-accountability when you develop a program like a 30, 60, 90-day goals because they came up with those goals. So there's this internal mechanism of them creating the goals and wanting to achieve them. The other one is, of course, over the 30, 60, 90 days is to create some system for check-ins. As a best practice, we typically see bi-weekly, but it could be monthly. And you may look at it within your organization and say, well, we only really check in with our employees once every 6 months or quarterly or at most one, or at most frequent once every month. But with a new hire, their learning curve and the agility that they need to have in their role while they're learning is much higher. So you typically do want, as a best practice, to have more check-ins more frequently at the onset of employment, and then scale that back to whatever the cadence is, however often you're meeting with your employees within the organization, whatever the standard is. But at the beginning, typically you do want more connection points. And also the one-on-ones can be your feedback loop. And those can be the mechanism to get the feedback and adjust things if needed. Again, that peer buddy comes into play in the first 90 days as they're creating that social connection. They're the ones demonstrating the company culture and imprinting the company culture on the new hire. And they're there for guidance should they need anything for support. And a peer buddy or mentorship program can be, again, as big or as little and have as many connection points as you want it to have. And we even see some systems. So if you use something like a Bamboo HR, if you use an ADP, if you use some of those systems, they've actually got modules in them now for peer buddy and mentor programs that you can almost automate the program. And again, get that time back, that it's not a manual mechanism and chewing up productive time as an organization. Recognition goes a long way. And so this can be recognizing efforts, what they've learned. Again, if they're demonstrating new skill sets, can be calling that out. And one thing that's always stuck with me in observing engagement and recognition is pen on paper matters. So if you can actually write them a note beyond an email, beyond just a verbal, and write them a note, being specific with what you're observing, it holds a ton of weight. Doesn't cost much, doesn't really cost a lot of time, but can be incredibly meaningful if you just spend some time putting pen on paper. And then foster team connection. So your onboarding program should have some type of team activities, meeting, informal conversations, because you want them to feel that belonging. And if you are off-site or remote, again, there are strategies to make this an effective program. We've seen quite a few organizations do Zoom lunches. We've seen quite a few organizations just do team meetings where people get to connect and share what's going on. There are different strategies or mechanisms you can use, even if you're offsite remote versus an on-site environment. And so here's a grid that we would see from some organizations in terms of what this is going to look like. And so you've got, your pre-boarding and orientation systems. That's all done in your first 30 days. Then you've got your 60 days, which is where you really start introducing the expectations and performance goals of the roles. They should be more familiar with the tools, the processes, and you're really going to uncover any gaps that were missed in the first 30 days in terms of onboarding. And then in the 90-day category from 60 to 90, you really should start to roll back things and they should really start functioning as an independent employee. And again, this can be a different level of oversight depending on the company culture and the role and how complex the role is. But these are typically what we would see, and then they should start really functioning in their role once they get through that 90 days. For some more task-oriented roles, that timeline can be shifted forward a little bit, but this should cover the majority of roles in terms of timeline. And not to say for the first 30 to 60 days that they can't do any independent work. But again, that increased level of feedback loop, that increased connection level, what that looks like for your organization can be different, but would start to be scaled back in that 60 to 90 days. And then this is what we've seen in terms of a 30, 60, 90-day plan. So again, it could be a page front and back. It does not need to reinvent the wheel, but it just brings some formality and structure to the onboarding process. And if you think about from an employee side, this is going to help them feel relaxed, that there is a plan, they have people to contact, there's a goal, they have some more clarity with their role. And it also create some face-to-face time, typically with somebody who would act as their superior and provide guidance for them. And so there's some bonding that occurs while you're filling out these 30, 60, 90-day plans. And again, some organizations will build these out and say for this role, this is 30, 60, 90 days, and this is what we want to happen for every role. But what I've seen as a best practice is, again, letting the employee drive what their goals are. They may not know all the intricate details of their role, but if you have a good hiring process, they should have a good general idea of what they're going to be doing. And they should be able to set some realistic goals for themselves. And again, if you're doing this in partnership, there's somebody guiding them through this. And so that's a really effective template. From an employer side of things, it also helps you assess if they're the right fit for the role within that 90-day period. And if they're a fit from a task performance perspective, if they're a fit for culture, all of those elements on the employee journey in those first 90 days. So streamlining your onboarding. So there's many different ways to elevate your onboarding program. One of the critical ones, which we see most organizations looking at, is onboarding through an HRIS or human capital system. So some examples would be Bamboo HR, Humi is another really popular one. Humi's a Canadian-based one. And what they do is they really give you a few different things. They give you a consistent experience. They give you time back because they're going to automate all the things that can be automated. And they're going to let you control and influence the experience that the employee has. So some of those mechanisms would be they'll manage the job offers. So they have e-signature functionality. They can send out the job offer. They'll track if everything's been signed, filled out properly. And so as a business owner or a leader, you just get an email saying that everything's good to go and they're good. You can also build onboarding checklists into them. So an example would be, say somebody is hired, they've done the job offer, they've signed everything. So from a legal perspective, they're an employee, they're ready to start, but maybe you need to order them a uniform. You need to make sure they have tools to do the job. They need maybe computer equipment or a tablet. And so, what you can set in these systems is an automatic trigger that once somebody's hired, a list goes to whoever would own that and say, hey, this person's been hired. Here's their details. You need to get X ready for them. Here's their start date. Also included in the offers would be your tax forms. If you have a, driver's abstract or a background check that needs to be completed, those can all be automated through the system. So having a great onboarding program does not necessarily mean that it's going to take a lot of time or cost a lot of money. The other one that we see that's becoming more and more popular is learning management systems delivered electronically. And so this can cover and allow for new employees to do their compliance training or do leadership training or do culture training as an organization. And a few benefits to this is, again, you can control that experience. You can match it to the culture or the vibe of the organization. You are also going to make sure that you're legally compliant should anything ever arise. We have our own HR LMS, and so we get to see how a lot of organizations execute this. And again, there's some pretty creative things that you can do in terms of delivery to make sure it's an engaging activity, and again, delivers a great onboarding experience. The other piece with an LMS system is it helps you meet your employee where they're at. So when I think about the different generations that we're hiring in different workplaces, an LMS system will work on a computer, it'll work on a Chromebook, it'll work on a phone, it'll work on a tablet, it'll work on the company computer at the office if that's where you want them to get it done. So it allows you to meet them where they're at and what platform that they want to complete it on. Other aspects is creating systems or processes. So a lot of this we see for onboarding is done through digital forms. And so this helps, again, allowing them to, track their time and having a clear expectation in terms of time. You can automate incident reporting, which would be like if a login's not working, again, you could have that all automated for them and show that there's a process and a system for them to support them through that. And then one key critical piece is, again, we talked about feedback loops, but it also ties to communication. And so just understanding what the communication and collaboration tools are of the organization. So some organizations use Teams, text message, some will use their scheduling software system for communication. So whatever you're using, just making sure it's a part of the onboarding and that they understand what it is. And that will also bring a level of connection for them so that they feel connected to the team with announcements or communication that's coming through. And so this is around thinking, okay, we've onboarded somebody. How do we get them up to speed? And so here's some best practices around what we've seen in terms of how do we get an employee from day 1 to day 90 functional in the role. And so the best practice by far is a hybrid approach. And so we actually see quite a few organizations adopting what's called a 70-20-10 learning model. So 70% of the job is learned on site in person, either through being trained on the job, or through a mentor, but it's on in person and while doing it. 20% is done through workshops, maybe some off-site training, those types of elements, and then 10% is done through online learning. But again and again, it continues to show that the in-person needs to be the more dominant approach for training, and it will lead to substantially better and more successful outcomes in terms of not only onboarding, but training the employee. Other ones that we've seen, and I'll emphasize the self-paced here online modules, which allows them to go at their own pace. And so an example of this that I came across recently was with an organization that did have all of their training for processes, they're office-based. So they had all of their knowledge articles online. And the self-paced was interesting because it was taking people a long time to do it. But what they were doing was they were doing the self-paced learning, going and checking the knowledge articles, and basically trying to practice. So it was nice for them to be able to pause that, execute it, and then go back to the training and go on to the next step. Then you've also got a benefit of doing different accessibility options. And again, this can be not only different devices, but meeting them where they're at. So whether or not that's learning on site, in an office, on a computer, through a phone, through a tablet, having different accessibility options allows them to choose which way they're going to learn best. Another mechanism that you can do is workshops versus and some hands-on training, but within a workshop context. And this just helps reinforce learning practices. But the other thing that workshops typically help with, especially if you do a blended workshop with more senior employees and newer employees, is it helps with sharing best practices and level setting expectations for roles. And then mentorship and peer learning, again, is always critical. And again, the data supports that this is a huge and intentional ROI for organizations in terms of mentorship and peer learning. Putting those programs into place always has a benefit to the organization. And so when you're onboarding a new employee, some other things to think about are around the culture and what they're experiencing. So one thing that we always try to identify is if onboarding is aligned with how the organization is operating. So an example is, if you say you're a remote first organization in your onboarding, but you have a mandate return to office program, you're not leading by example, and there's going to be a disconnect between that employee's journey and onboarding and how they're feeling about the organization, because there's a uh, friction there between what they're being told and what they're observing. So making sure you're leading by example, and especially leaders are modeling the behaviors and showing what great looks like. The other one is ongoing learning. So understanding that not everybody's going to learn everything in one go. And you're probably not going to get them to learn everything in the first 90 days, but they should be functional within the first 90 days. But being very clear in terms of what ongoing learning looks like. And this could be part of onboarding in the form of a continuous learning or continuous education program. And what that looks like for different can vary between different organizations, from one extreme to paying for schooling to others for having conversations in one-on-ones and being intentional to have conversations around what learning would mean a lot to them. Career growth is important to be clear around. Recognition is also very important to be clear around, what is going to get recognized and what behaviors matter to the organization. One thing with recognition too is just being consistent around what you're recognizing and what you recognize for. And then learning incentives can also be critical. And you see this in some onboarding in some organizations where once you achieve a certain certification, maybe there's a merit increase or a one-time bonus. But that's also a mechanism that you can use through the employee journey. And I mentioned this a bit earlier, but this one is very important around aligning the training and the onboarding with organizational goals. So your onboarding should align with the business objectives and not only the skill of the role, but making sure that skill aligns with the business objective. If it's not clear, then typically you can have a disconnect and that can lead to disengagement from the employee, especially if it's substantial enough when you're onboarding them in the first 90 days that they feel lied to or that you were untruthful to them. And that can lead to turnover or disengagement from employees. The other one is you want to understand what your gaps are. And in an onboarding perspective, the way that I look at this, especially in the current labor market, is if you need somebody with a certain skill set. So they need to understand three different areas of your business: operational, on-site, customer. Well, maybe it's hard to find somebody with all three skills. That person is very, very hard to attract to the company, and your time to hire is very long. So as an organization, you may say, well, we're okay with the operational skills and the offsite skills, but and so we're okay. They need to have those two, but we're okay accepting if they don't have the customer service training yet. And we're going to develop that. Well, if that's going to be your approach and that's who you're going to hire, your onboarding and your training for onboarding needs to assess that and needs to identify and correct for that skill gap that you've accepted as an organization. So you want to make sure that's built into the onboarding program. The other thing you want to do, and this goes back to the 30, 60, 90-day plans, you want to set clear and measurable training goals for them. What's their goal? What are they going to be able to produce? And as they achieve those milestones, confirming it, reinforcing it, and then setting new goals throughout that journey. And those goals can also tie back to any gaps in knowledge or skill that you identified through the hiring process that you need to make sure that they receive. And then with an onboarding program, the monitoring and adjust training programs is absolutely critical. Your organization will change over time. That's natural. It's a living organism, essentially. It will change over time. That's never going to change. So you do want to monitor your onboarding and make sure it's still effective as to who you are as an organization, what your culture is, and is the onboarding is it relevant to the role that people are doing? In terms of how often, smaller organizations can be once every 2, 3 years. Larger organizations especially that are going through a period of growth, typically you want to look at it every year. And maybe the answer is no, it's completely valid. We're happy with it. But you do want to kind of reflect on it at least once a year, even if it isn't a huge process, because it's still valid, and still an effective onboarding program. And so thanks everyone for joining. I really appreciate the time and to be able to speak to onboarding. Hopefully there's some questions to walk away with to ask yourself and answer for yourself in terms of implementing onboarding. Hopefully we're able to share some best practices that might be applicable to you. And some, ones for me that are fairly easy to implement. Just building a first aid checklist can have a monumental impact on an organization. A buddy system doesn't really have any cost, but again, can give that benefit of that feel for an employee joining. And translating key materials so that, again, they're intentional and purposeful for the employee. So do they actually speak to what they're supposed to speak to on their first day? Last thing to share is we're very excited to partner with ISSA, and we have a health, HR compliance and health check that we do. Typically, this health check lands around the $1,200 to $1,400, but we're happy to do a flat fee, $600 for a full health check. Part of this health check will audit your hiring and your onboarding programs, as well as your legal compliance, benefits, health and safety, really the full entire HR circle. But included in this is hiring and onboarding in terms of process and strategy. And I hand it over to anybody that may want to share any questions that they may have, or if they want to share any questions in the chat, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Do we have any questions? Brad, I'm curious, when it comes to your onboarding, and I know you and I had had this discussion prior to today's session, and you had said about the first week being pivotal in whether or not someone remains with a company. From your experience, what would you say is the number one priority for business owners to take into consideration to get those employees or potential new hires to remain engaged and become a
Yeah.
part of the company? Like, is it culture? Like, is it the business culture?
Yeah, I would say both my experience and the data would suggest that the culture is your most critical element. But if I look at it from a operator lens, what would I look for? So the two things that I would look for is one, am I living up to the expectations that I set in the hiring process? If there's any deviation in the what was committed to or shown or demonstrated or implied in the hiring process in terms of workplace culture and environment and job, that will typically result in a bit of distrust and that will definitely increase your attrition and that not joining the organization. And the second one does really come down to the simple mechanics of just having a plan for onboarding. And
Hmm.
Tanya, as I shared with you, some companies invest, over the top into their onboarding. You don't have to do that, but you do have to have a plan. And so even that one slide with just the day by day for the first 5 days can give you a really big return on investment. But those would be the two areas from an operator lens that I would look at and try to make sure we're on par with is what the new hire experiencing what we communicated through the hiring process? Do those align completely? And if there are friction points, address those.
Hmm.
And do we have a plan for onboarding? And what you'll find too, even if you start with a simple plan, so as I said, even if you just create an onboarding checklist today, that will grow month over month, year over year as you learn, as people get onboarded. And I can almost guarantee you, when you look back a year from now, 2 years from now, what your onboarding was when you just simply did that checklist, when you spent 5 minutes to sit down to build a checklist to where you are now, the program will have risen significantly. And then if you start looking at employee engagement alignment, you'll start noticing noticeable increases in those areas as well.
Interesting. Now, James, I don't know. Brad, are you going to make these slides available?
I can. Yep. I know
Okay.
this is recorded and I know you're going to send it out.
Yes.
But if there's a request for the slides, I absolutely can share them. No problem.
Perfect. Another question for you goes to age brackets, because obviously the way older generation individuals learn is different from, younger generations coming in. Are you seeing that, and do business owners have to take that into consideration and say have a different training process in mind dependent on these age brackets?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There's a few parts to that. I'm going to touch on one really quickly. So from you asked
Mm,
earlier around is culture important? So
mhm,
definitely when we look at generations in the workplace, we look at, your Gen Z, even into millennial, we see candidates walking away from roles because the culture is not a fit, even down to something as specific as they don't have their stance in terms of environmental stance, what they're doing for community or environment as an organization. So that becomes incredibly critical. In terms of delivery for training, the short answer is yes, but it can be very complex. And it also depends on the means available to the organization. If you've
mm.
got an infinite budget, you probably can design onboarding, not just by generation, but by any learning ability in terms of what's going to land best with that employee. Um, but pending infinite resources, the model that I typically suggest that would cover and create a good foundation for you is that 70-20-10. 70% of the learning is done on the job with either a mentor, a peer buddy, an expert in that.
Mhm.
20% is done through workshops and 10% is done through learning. If you follow that model, you're going to typically cover not just a generational gap, but you'll cover the majority of them, majority of the different learning abilities, learning styles, all of those. If you have the funds available, yes, having different mechanisms for training will improve that. Yes.
I thank you all for your time. Brad, I thank you for the information,
Happy
and
to.
have a great day, everybody.